Hi folks! Yes, I'm finally back with another terrible murder story. This one is an oldie but a goodie, or a baddie, from way back in the 80s. A twisted case with a plot like an Agatha Christie novel. This is the case of the self-described genius poisoner, George Trepal. Let's get into it. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Delaney, and I'm a feature writer by day and true crime writer by night. If you're like me and you like to geek out about true crime and you don't get offended by a few cuss words here and there, you're in the right place. Today, I want to go back to one of the first cases that ever caught my eye that got me into true crime in the first place. It takes place in Florida, of course, in the late 80s. 1988 to be exact. This case is really about the Carr family. Yes, the whole family. They were a large blended family from Alturas, Florida, which is a small rural community in west central Florida. Peggy and her husband Pi lived there with their 4 children from previous marriages plus 1 grandbaby. By the way, his real name was Pererlin, which I'm probably not pronouncing right, which is why he just went by Pi. It's probably not a shocker that life in a household like that had plenty of chaos and conflict. For one thing, Peggy and Pi's marriage was kind of on shaky ground. They had only recently reconciled after Peggy discovered Pi had been having an affair with a woman from work. She took her half of the family and split for a while, but eventually decided to try and make the marriage work for the sake of the kids. Outside of that, they were having constant drama with their only neighbors, George Trepal and his wife, Dr. Diana Carr.
No relation.
Diana was constantly bitching at them about the noise coming from the Carr's house. Their dog was barking and chasing her cats. The kids were playing the music too loud. You know, typical Karen behavior. So in response, Travis and Dwayne, who were 16 and 17 years old, did exactly what you'd expect teenagers to do. They turned up the music, set off fireworks, tore ass around their property on their 4-wheelers, and just generally yanked Diana's chain however they could. But despite all the drama with Diane, most of the Carr family thought George was a nice guy. He wasn't the one yelling at them or calling the cops. The boys said that whenever they would see him, he would smile and wave at them. They figured he was just kind of a nerdy hermit, but harmless. But apparently, he was just as annoyed with the Carrs as Diana was. In March 1988, George complained to the local zoning board that Pi was converting his garage into an apartment for his daughter and baby granddaughter. That got Pi cited for a zoning violation, which forced him to halt construction and shell out more money in order to get all the proper permits. So, this brings us to October 23rd, 1988. Peggy and her daughter Galena, who went by Sissy, were working as servers at a local restaurant when Peggy began feeling really sick. She told Sissy she was having pains in her chest, her hands felt numb, and her legs really hurt. She was afraid she might be having a heart attack. So she took off work early and drove home to lay down, but the pain only got worse. Later, Pi called his sister, who was a nurse, to come over and look at Peggy. She took Peggy's vitals and said she probably just had some kind of virus. But Peggy's pain just got worse and worse to the point where she couldn't even walk. At first, Pi didn't want to take her to the ER, but after Sissy insisted, Pi carried her out to his car and drove her to the hospital. At the ER, Peggy told the doctor she felt like she was on fire, but the doctors couldn't seem to find the cause. And one doctor even told Peggy, can you guess what he told Peggy? That her symptoms were all in her head. Ladies, let me know in the comments the worst thing a doctor has ever told you was all in your head. Anyway, they kept her in the hospital for observation for 3 days. Her condition seemed to improve, so they sent her home. To celebrate her recovery, Pi's sister served the family a big fried chicken dinner along with Cokes to drink. Soon after eating that dinner, Peggy's symptoms returned, and now Dwayne and Travis started feeling sick too. At first, the boys thought they were just hungover, but after a while, they felt tingling in their fingers, upset stomachs, and burning sensations throughout their bodies. This time, Peggy was rushed to a different hospital. They did some routine tests, but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. However, while one of her doctors was examining her, he noticed that her hair was falling out. That just so happened to be a symptom of ingesting thallium. Thallium is a tasteless, odorless element that used to be used to kill rats until it was banned in the 1970s. Thallium is so toxic that just 1 gram can kill an adult, and thallium poisoning is extremely painful. It causes nerve damage that can feel like numbness, pins and needles, or fire in your fingers and toes. It can also cause severe stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, and confusion. If it's caught early enough, it can be treated, but it's a drawn-out, difficult process involving literally filtering out your blood. So the doctor had Peggy tested for thallium. When the results came back a day later, they showed Peggy had 20,000 times the natural amount of thallium in her system. Dwayne and Travis were tested too, and their tests also came back positive, but they didn't have quite as much as their system as Peggy did. Pie, Sissy, and baby Casey also tested positive for trace amounts of thallium. Dwayne ended up being hospitalized for 2 months, Travis for 6 months, but they both eventually recovered. But since Peggy had ingested such a huge amount of thallium and hadn't been diagnosed until it had been in her system for so long, the prognosis didn't look good. She got weaker and weaker and in more and more pain by the day. She eventually lost her ability to speak and could only use sign language to communicate. Then she slipped into a coma. On March 3rd, 1989, 4 long months after she'd been poisoned, her family made the heartbreaking decision to take her off of life support. Peggy, who was only 41, died shortly afterwards. This was now a homicide investigation. Police, of course, questioned Pye since he and Peggy had recently had marital problems and he had left town on a hunting trip just before the family got sick. And there was the fact that he had delayed taking Peggy to the hospital at first. But once the test revealed he'd been poisoned too, he was taken off the suspect list. So police tested everything in and around the house, from the well water to the trees and the orchards around the property. Remember, thallium had been used as a pesticide, so the orchards might have been sprayed with it, and that could have contaminated the groundwater. They did finally find the thallium in some empty Coke bottles in their trash. That could mean possible product tampering, so that put the case under the jurisdiction of the FBI. Their labs also found thallium in some unopened Coke bottles in the fridge. When they inspected these unopened bottles closer, they found microscopic tool marks on the lids, like they had been very carefully taken off and then replaced. This would have been a time-consuming, meticulous process, so there's no way it could have been done in the plant or a grocery store. Someone would have had to buy the drinks and then carefully pried the lids off, put the thallium inside, and then very carefully put the lids back on so that they didn't look like they'd been opened and they didn't leak out and let the soda inside go flat. And the weird thing was, no one in the Carr family could remember buying these Cokes. They usually drank Pepsi. But with so many of them living there and buying groceries, everyone just assumed that someone else had bought them. They told investigators that since Alturas was such a safe little community, they never locked their doors, so anyone could have come inside and just left them there. So who would have wanted to poison not just Peggy, but potentially the whole Carr family? At first, they couldn't think of anyone. Pye remembered all the troubles he and his family had been having with the neighbors, but he didn't think they were anything serious enough to be motive for murder. Then he remembered something. Earlier that summer, Pye had received an anonymous letter. It was addressed to him in Bartow, Florida, which is where Alturas' mail is sent because it's such a small town. But that's something that only people who lived there or knew someone who lived there would know. The letter itself had been typewritten on a Post-it, and it said, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever or else you all die. This is no joke." Pye said he figured it was actually a joke, just a sick prank, and so he just kind of forgot about it. Then, in October, only 2 days before Peggy had gotten sick, Diana had showed up at the Carr's house on a tear. The family said she was screaming and cussing and yelling, ranting and raving about them playing their music too loud. They said her level of anger was way out of proportion to the situation. And when Peggy didn't just roll over to Diana's demands, they said she stormed off and shouted, "You won't get away with this, and this isn't over." Could this be a possible motive? So investigators started digging into Diana and George's background. They found out the couple were both extremely intelligent. Diana had majored in chemistry in college and now was an orthopedic surgeon. George described himself as a freelance computer programmer and didn't appear to have any other kind of job outside the home. They were both members of MENSA, a club for people whose IQs are among the top 2% in the nation. Not that an IQ test measures anything other than your skill at taking IQ tests. Despite Diana's many arguments with the Carr family and her background in chemistry, it was George that had investigators squinting. When they had first questioned him, when they were doing the original investigation and questioning all the friends and neighbors, they said he had seemed nervous, avoided eye contact, and was stuttering. When they asked him why he thought someone might want to poison the Carrs, his answer was, someone must have wanted them to move out of the neighborhood. Out of the more than 50 people the police had questioned, he was the only person to say anything like that, which also just happened to be exactly what that anonymous note had said.
Suspicious.
George also claimed that he went with Diana to her work, so he wasn't at home during the day and didn't have access to the Carr's house. But this directly conflicted with the Carr family's observation that George hardly ever left his house. He also told police that he didn't know anything about thallium, which was also a lie. So who really was George Trepal? He was born in 1949 in New York City, the son of a policeman and an elementary school teacher. He attended Clemson University in South Carolina, where he studied chemistry for 2 years before changing his major to psychology. He graduated in 1972. So he was in college in the late 60s and early 70s. So yes, there was drug use. But even in that kind of atmosphere, he was known for enjoying his drugs and lots of them. He also apparently liked sharing them with others, with or without their consent. For example, at one point, he became convinced, for whatever reason, that other students were sneaking into his dorm room when he was gone. So he coated his doorknob with hallucinogens designed to be absorbed into the skin to supposedly teach the trespassers a lesson. Another time, while he was on a road trip with a friend, they would pick up unsuspecting hitchhikers and give them brownies or cookies laced with drugs just to watch their reactions. After college in 1975, he was arrested in Charlotte, South Carolina for running one of the largest meth labs in the Southeast. He served 3 years in federal prison. The 70s. Interestingly, he was known to use a particular method of cooking meth known as the P2P method, which involves the use of, you guessed it, thallium. After he served his time, George appeared to be on the straight and narrow. He and Diana met at a MENSA meeting. They seemed like a great couple. Both of them were very intelligent, and George was kind of a passive guy, which actually allowed Diana to pursue her career ambitions. The two were also kind of murder nerds. They both loved true crime and murder mysteries. George even studied police training manuals and considered himself to be an expert on crime scene procedure. You know, basically a detective. One of their few social outlets was organizing and hosting these MENSA murder mystery weekends, where they stage these fake homicide scenes, then lead the guests through the clues to solve them. In April 1989, a month after Peggy's death, Diana and George hosted another one of these murder mystery weekends with the theme of poisoning.
Suspicious.
In the booklet that George wrote for the participants, it said, "When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, 'I don't like you, move, or else.'"
That's weird.
And this is where George first met Sherry Gwynn. So, the Polk County Sheriff's Department had a pretty strong suspicion that George was the poisoner, but they didn't have any actual evidence against him. So they brought in Detective Susan Gorick, who was a veteran undercover officer. Sherry, Detective Gorick, was able to befriend George and Diana fairly easily. And since Diana worked so much, it wasn't hard for her to spend time with George alone. During one visit, Detective Gorick noticed a book lying on the table, The Pale Horse by Agatha Christie. Spoiler alert, the novel's murderer used thallium to poison his victims.
That's weird.
So the sheriff's department renamed that undercover operation Operation Pale Horse. There were other little hints that George was a poisoner too. At one point, when Sherry was complaining to him about her divorce, George suggested that she should poison her husband to get what she wanted in the divorce settlement. During another visit, she found out that George made homemade wine, and for that hobby, he owned a special tool that could recap bottles. Police expected Operation Pale Horse to last a few months, but they couldn't find any real evidence, and George was too smart to confess to murder. So the operation ended up going on for over 2 years. They finally caught a break when George and Diana moved to Sebring, Florida, so that Diana could set up a new practice. Sherry immediately convinced them to rent her their old house before they could finish moving all their things out. As soon as Sherry had the keys in her hot little hands, she had crime scene technicians come over and search the house. Inside the garage, they found chemicals, lots and lots of chemicals, but no thallium. But they also found some empty bottles, one of which had a white powdery residue at the bottom. The bottle was tested, and the powder was identified as thallium. In fact, the same type of thallium that had poisoned the Carrs. Now that they finally had some physical evidence tying George to the crime, they went to Sebring to arrest him. When she answered the door, Diana was livid. She even tried to block the police from entering their home. They had to physically restrain her. Again, typical Karen behavior. When they finally were able to get into the house, George was standing at the top of the staircase in nothing but a pair of bikini underwear. When they told him he was under arrest, his only response was, "Can I put some clothes on?" Yeah, dude. A search of their new house uncovered several poison and chemistry books, including a pamphlet George had written called Chemistry for the Complete Idiot, Practical Guide to All Chemistry. They also found a 3-ring binder with the title General Poison Guide. It contained photocopied pages from a book called Poison Detection in Human Organs and a chapter from another book titled Death by Poison Synopsis. These pages included entries on thallium, and they were covered in George's fingerprints. In January 1991, George was charged with 15 criminal counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, poisoning food or water, and product tampering. His defense was based on the fact that the case against him was entirely circumstantial and that the only piece of physical evidence against him was the bottle with the thallium residue that was found in his unlocked garage. Anyone could have put that bottle in there.
Sure, Jan.
Their central argument was that, according to the prosecution's case, there was just as much reason to suspect Diana as there was George. But it didn't work. After 4 entire weeks of testimony, the jury only deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. He was sentenced to death. Though he's filed numerous appeals, including an attempt to exclude the thallium bottle evidence on the basis that the FBI lab had been found to have conducted sloppy work in other cases, he remains on death row in Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. And despite being one of his strongest defenders, Diana divorced him in 1996. Detective Gorick, with the help of Jeffrey Good, a reporter with the St. Petersburg Times, wrote a book about the case titled Poison Mind. And that's it for the case of George Trepal. Had you heard about this case before? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure and hit the like button and subscribe for more terrible stories like this. Till next time, Darklings.